Everything changes, everything is connected, pay attention. I love that. So the other thing that I love are surprises. Well, let me qualify it. Most times I love surprises, like when the sprinkler broke in the front yard last week, that was a surprise. And I wouldn't say that that thrilled me, but most times I like surprises. And I had a surprise this morning. And the surprise is this. My brother Lee, who I love and adore deeply, had no idea who the band Traffic was. We are a loving community, man. I just saw the pitchforks come out. What? You don't know? What? Leave this room. I'll bet you by next Sunday he knows them. Yeah. So Traffic. So the reason I said, what are people saying about this, right? I love it. Blind faith, blind faith. You got to know blind faith. Blind faith? Yeah. Yes. Everything's connected, but everything passes, everything changes. So anyway, Steve Winwood. Anyway, there's a song by Traffic that's been kind of the theme this week for me. Actually, they didn't write this song. They did a rendition of a song. It's actually an old Celtic ballad called John Barleycorn Must Die. You all know that song, John Barleycorn? There were three men. So it's a song really about the threshing and of the harvesting, and because it's dealing with autumn. And I guess that's the point I'm attempting to make in a very long, interesting way, is that it is now, we're moving towards the season of autumn. This is the last week of summer. And it's also the last week of our quarterly theme of being thank you, from all discord, freedom from all discord, yes. So, God, I already lost my place on that. I'm a little flummoxed. So let me get back to where I want to be. Freedom from discord. So, to me, autumn symbolizes this season where things begin to pass. Things begin to die. And they begin to die, we look at the great wheel, that it's not like there's a permanence, because, you know, when we watch the world as it unfolds, when we watch the universe as it unfolds, it's more cyclical than linear. It's autumn precedes winter, which precedes spring, which precedes summer, where we are in right now. And so we are both seeing something passing as something is wanting to emerge. Something is dying so something else can come forward. It's just basically the nature of how things are. And it's a great metaphor when we look at our own life and how we realize that there are seasons in our own life that sometimes pass for another season, another chapter, another experience, another adventure for us to begin. St. Paul writes this in the book of Corinthians. He says, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I reasoned like a child. I thought like a child. But now I have become a man, and I have put an end to childish things." And then he goes on to say, "We see a reflection in a mirror. Then we will see face to face. Now I know partially, but then I will know completely, in the same way that I have been completely known." And I think that's the catcher, that I will see completely in the same way that I was completely known. So there's this invitation to spiral into something, to settle into something deeper, you know, to experience this thing that I think is the most important truth. If you have learned anything from me, learn this, that the truest thing about you is that you are seen, you are known, and you are loved by that very presence and force that brought all creation into being. It is as vast and as transcendental as our own imagination will allow it to travel, but it is as personal and it is as deep and as connected to us as the very breath that we breathe. And so in some way, what I would say is, my talk today is this idea of saying goodbye, because what is it that is kind of viscerally saying, it's time to let this go. Something is wanting to emerge. Something is coming, and maybe I don't even articulate what it is, and I probably am not articulating what it is if I'm more focused on what is passing. Because we really can't see it if we're still immersed in the experience of where we're wanting to go with this. And as we're moving towards this newness, one of the things that happens next week, during close to the equinox, next Sunday will be the equinox, but close to that is Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year's. But Megra is also around this time. There's a lot of cultures that see, interestingly enough, autumn as a time of beginning of a new year. In fact, the Kabbalists think, or they teach, or they express, or they dance, or whatever the word is that I want to use, that on Rosh Hashanah is not only just the new year, but it's the birthday of the universe. And so it's this movement into a new creation, something new, another cycle in this thing. I was thinking this week, what do you get a universe that's 14 plus whatever billion years old? But we celebrate this intention, this experience of what is new and what is wanting to come. And I was thinking also this week, there's this line of this story from Jesus in the Gospel of St. Matthew. And he begins it by saying, he's telling a story, and he's talking about, don't be concerned, don't worry. And then he says this really interesting thing. He says, consider the lilies of the field. He says, they don't work, they don't sow, they don't engage. And then he says, but then Solomon, in all his glory, is not arrayed in such beauty as these. And then he goes on to say, in this same quote of sayings that the author had put attributing to him, is he says this, he says, seek first the kinship of God and its right beingness, and then all else will be given to you. Which I think is a lovely thought, but it struck me that really what he's going back to is he's referencing Solomon. So in the Hebrew story, in the legends and the myths of the great kings and the things that were going on, in the book of Kings, 1 Kings, there's a story of Solomon. And the story goes that Solomon was, his father was David, and when David died and he was ascending the throne, God says, what do you want? And he says, I want wisdom. I want discernment. And then the story goes that the Holy One says to him, because you have not asked for a thing like a new car or a pyramid or a sphinx or whatever kings in the ancient world would get, he says, because you did not ask for a thing, I will grant you all these things. You will be the greatest of kings in your lifetime. Because instead of asking for a thing, you asked for a state of consciousness. Because you asked for wisdom, everything else is given, which is kind of exactly what Jesus I think, is saying here as well. Because I think, so let me put it this way. Here's the deal. The art of manifestation, the ability to manifest, is not an exact science. And anybody that can promise you 3 steps, 2 words, 1 thing, whatever, to manifest your heart's desire is not telling you the truth. Treatment that we do, our form of prayer, regular prayer, ceremonial magic, whatever, however you do, what these things do is they help straighten the path. They get our attention. But there's no magic pill that says to do it this way or do it that way. There's something else more nuanced, which is instead of going for the thing, go for the wisdom. And the wisdom itself allows us to be positioned to what we're wanting. There's this other statement of Jesus where he says, you can't put new wine in an old wineskin because it'll burst the wineskin. You can't put a new cloth on an old garment because it'll rip it off. Because what he's saying there, I believe, is this, is you can't treat, pray, whatever your practice is, you can't do that for a new thing if the old paradigm is still there. You cannot treat for prosperity if the paradigm that you're living by is poverty. You can't treat for love if your habit is to be afraid. You can't treat for health if you're, going to Jack in the Box every week. Whatever the case may be, there's an incongruency. There isn't a magic pill on how we do this. Rather, what there is an invitation to, as Ernest Holmes says, we don't get what we want in this life, we get what we become. And so part of that whole thing of getting what we become is letting go of old habits. And I've been sitting with this word all week, habits, because I love etymology. When you look at the roots of a word, the root of habit is actually how we dress, a habit, a habiliment. The Latin word for it is how we attire ourselves. So in many ways, habits are what our clothes are. Habits are what our thoughts wear. You with me on this? Because you take all the experiences that we've ever had, and that kind of creates a garment by which we clothe our thoughts. And so sometimes the thing of it is when you think in terms of poverty, and I'm not, again, this is not an exact science, so I'm not saying that everybody in the world that is poor is because they have a habit of poverty. But what I would say, especially in a culture such as ours, is that we run the danger of thinking that it's outside of us, and sometimes it's inside of us. And sometimes it's important for us to examine ourselves and see what our habitual thoughts are, what our self-talk continues to say, how our mind has been ingrained in a certain way that it always returns to kind of a default way of being. I used to have a friend of mine, and she was a healer, and she said, one of the tough things about being a healer, she said, is she would work with people and they would get healed, but then they would come up with another condition, another thing. It was kind of like whack-a-mole. You treat this and that worked, and then all of a sudden it shows up here. Because really what was going on is they were more in the paradigm of ill health than that they were in the consciousness of health itself. And you see that, I remember reading this statistic years ago about, people that win lotteries. You would think, if all I have to do is win $10 million, my life would be set. And yet you find, like, within 2 years, 4 years, whatever it is, they're usually more broke than they were when they had it. Because if the consciousness hasn't changed, it doesn't matter how much money you give somebody, they will figure out how to return to their habit of poverty if that hasn't changed. And it doesn't matter how many dating apps you go on, if your idea about who you are doesn't change, it doesn't matter if Prince Charming or Princess Charming shows up, you will figure out a way to sabotage that relationship. Because it's not the external thing, it's the internal thing that often creates the repetition of our life. Because if you ever say to yourself, if you hear you're saying, here it goes again, or there it is again, or anytime we do those kinds of things, maybe it's not outside. Maybe, just maybe, sometimes it's on the inside. And sometimes those ideas need to shift. David Foster Wallace wrote this in his book, This is Water, which is just an amazing essay. He says this, he says, everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, most vivid and important person in existence. We rarely talk about this sort of natural, basic self-centeredness because it's socially repulsive. But it's pretty much the same for all of us deep down. It is our default setting, hardwired into our boards at birth. Think about it. There is no experience that you have had that you were not at the absolute center of it. The world as you experience it is right there in front of you or behind you, to the left or the right of you, on your TV or your monitor or whatever. Other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, real. Meaning, cooperators are standing by, but we become so enchanted with our own story that we're telling ourselves about how things are and what's going on, that sometimes we miss these things because we're addicted, or we have the habit of the story that we tell ourselves about why things are. And sometimes that story was good at the beginning, but may no longer be necessary. I struggled with sharing the story that I wanted to share with you because I don't want it to be misunderstood. It's from Don Milo Duquette's book, My Life with the Spirits. And take it for how you want it, because it's a story of an exorcism. Now, you can believe in exorcisms or not. You can believe in spirits or not. That's not the point. That's not why I'm telling the story. I'm telling the story to illustrate something different. So him and a buddy of his were called, in the book he writes, they were called to do an exorcism. There was a woman that had been abused by her stepfather since she was a small child. And how she coped with this is there was this imaginary dragon that came up, and while she was being abused, it took her away from the pain and the trauma of what was going on. It kept her sort of safe in her imagination. But what happened is she found herself incapable of being in any kind of healthy or sustaining relationship, because although the story of the dragon kept her safe as a child, it was sabotaging her capacity to be engaged in loving, nurturing relationships. Do you kind of see the paradigm in this? So in a sense, it was kind of like, thank you very much for keeping me safe as a child, and now you have to go away. And that's like so many habits that each of us have. They may have been really good. They may have had a point. At some point when we develop these habitual thoughts, we call them beliefs, we were looking at things, as St. Paul says, as a child or as a young person or as an adolescent or a person who was in trauma or a person who was scared or whatever the case may be, whatever the external things were. Our highest wisdom at that point was to develop an idea that kept us safe and protected. And that was a good thing until it wasn't, until we find then that our life changes forever and has become limited and confined because we're stuck in a paradigm that doesn't let us grow. So, my invitation for each of us today then is just to consider this. Is there something in your heart? Is there a longing, a desire for something? Think about that. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands or anything like that, but I'm just going to invite you to consider that thought. Is there something that you desire? Is there something that you long for? And can you begin to articulate what prevents that from coming? Is there a thought? Is there a habit? Is there a belief that acts as a barrier to the very thing that is calling you? And maybe you might even want to consider, what was the genesis of that thought? When was that idea or belief a good thing? And where is it now becoming uncomfortable? And the thing about habits, like horses, you don't break them, you reconcile them, you engage them. And sometimes with a habit, as Dr. Holmes says, we begin to not necessarily banish that, but we create something new that begins to neutralize that and to replace that. So if you can think right now of what is the barrier, maybe the next thought can be, if I am letting this go, who am I going to be? What am I supposed to look like? How do I function? You know, if what you're treating for is health, how does a healthy person live? If I am treating for love, what does loving look like? What does it feel like? What does it experience? What skills do I need to learn? And then, because, you know, our work is so centered in the imaginal, is there a model? Is there a prototype? Is there somebody or something that I can see, and then I can kind of use that imagination as a portal to allow me to enter into the imaginal world, where then I can begin to see myself in this situation as a different person than who I am today. I will tell you, in my 20 plus years in ministry, what I have learned to appreciate about manifestation, it's all about self-esteem. It's all about loving ourself. It's all about loving ourself enough to let go of habitual thoughts that no longer serve us, to create the space for loving experiences and moving with the desire, which I believe is Spirit luring us into a greater experience of flourishing. Eugene Terracut, who's a philosopher that I follow, says it this way. He says, how do you fight a losing battle and not lose it? There is a victory beyond the external triumph. It's a glimpse of paradise on earth. When the odds become unsurmountable, something stirs within us, and we rise above fear and despair with a sudden and inexplicable desire to stand to the end. There's something about that invitation to move beyond that. And in these days, that's more important than in any other time probably in human history. Because as I quoted last week, Abraham Heschel said in the 50s that the greatest ecumenical movement in the country is nihilism. Ponder that. That's the growing spirituality of our world, is nihilism. And nihilism, unrestrained, leads to terrible things. Just read a book, and you can see it, how it's placed itself in history. And our work as a community, but as individuals, and as individuals who make up a community, is to replace that sense of nihilism, which was probably a good idea at the time, but no longer serves us. Those habits of lack, loss, pain, poverty, sins, sickness, and death, they may have served us at a time, but I ask you, do they serve you today? And what would Spirit invite differently? What would that presence that knows you, sees you, loves you, and is always present invite you to become Where is this divine presence leading you? And in order to move forward, what is it that you need to leave behind? So let's just take that moment into prayer. Recognizing the One, the Holy One, that which is the Ein Sof, the allness within the allness within the allness. It is the source of all creation. It's that which creates, sustains, renews, that which is novel and agile, but is the presence of unrelenting love. It is the truest thing about me as it is the truest thing about each and every person in this room. That we are loved, we are known, we are seen, we are guided. It's like I always say, cooperators are standing by. There is that presence that is available to us. It is the agreement that says, yes, yes, yes. And sometimes it is that which says, this is greater than I can comprehend. This is greater than I know, and I don't know the way out, but I know that I can be guided. I know that I can listen. I know that I am teachable. Guide me. Show me the next indicated step. But most of all, in this moment, here and now, as I sit in this room on this chair, breathing, I am grateful for the breath in me. I am grateful for the life in me. I am grateful for the community that surrounds me. I am grateful for the joy that is there for me. And I let that come as I let go of anything that is not that. And so it is.